When we were talking about this event and the "Prepare for When" tagline, it really resonated exactly for what we work with our customers. So as Bob mentioned, we're a leading security provider, a lot of our customers in the cloud, and they don't just click their heels and get there, right? So we help our customers on that journey to the cloud. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is how we work with customers to help them develop a security-enabled blueprint for moving to a cloud-enabled security blueprint. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the attack surface because the attack surface is a little different in the cloud than it is in other places. And so understanding that and thinking about your assets in that context really helps us direct moving to that, developing that blueprint. Now it's working too well. So just wanted to start talking about the awareness disconnect that we see out there. So key to knowing the right controls to put in your environment when you're moving to the cloud is understanding what your attack surface is in the cloud. And what we see is that it's really pretty significantly different than what we see on-prem, and where you need to focus and where you need to put your resources sometimes isn't as intuitive as maybe you would think it would be. And that oftentimes the dominant exposures that we do see in the cloud are misunderstood. So what we start with is the kind of inherent difficulty we have in our own brains with processing perception versus reality sometimes. And if we don't go back to data, we often find ourselves tricked. We make decisions based on what we think we see versus what data may tell us. And just kind of an example out there that I think shows this is when you think about looking at maps, oftentimes maps are drawn such that a country like Russia and a continent like Africa look very similar in size. And if you just relied on that map, if you just looked at that map and your perception of that size, you might make decisions or make assumptions about those two land masses that were completely wrong if you actually went and looked at the square miles that are covered by each of those land masses. So what we talk to customers about as they're on this journey, as they're preparing for when, as they move to the cloud, is about identifying key cloud assets, measuring your exposure within those assets, and then implementing the proper controls. So, what do we know about this? Just give you a quick minute. So we're going to talk a lot about data that we have. I have a lot of data in this presentation that's derived from our internal data set. So who are we? How does that data stand up? What is our perspective on this problem? So we have 4,000 plus customers. 80% of those customers have assets in data centers, or their data center of deployments of some kind. 50% of our deployments are actually public and hybrid cloud deployments. So if you think about that, the number of customers whose security data we are collecting and analyzing, we have a really kind of unparalleled view at what are the actual threats that customers in the cloud are experiencing. And that really helps us bring data to this problem to help you understand where you might want to be focusing. And the dominant workload we see within our customers are business-critical web applications. So it's interesting. So we have, the one other point on that last slide is that we see that in our data set, we see that 75% of attacks are web application attacks. And that is the dominant type of attack by far. And for a lot of years, we looked at other data sets and we didn't see exactly that same data coming through. The Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, a report that's near and dear to my heart. I haven't spent a full 17 years in security at AlertLogic. I spent a good chunk of time at Verizon as well. And when we did this report, when we were looking at this report when I got to AlertLogic and kind of comparing the data sets, initially kind of back in the 2014 timeline, as you can see that little gray bar, web application attacks, ooh, it looks like they got shifted up there, but web application attacks were not composing as many of the attacks as they are today. So in their last reports, we see a huge jump in the percentage of breaches, the kind of breaches that Bob was talking about earlier, we see a huge jump in the type of the source of those breaches being web application attacks. And so at the same time, so we said, great, okay, finally our data is kind of making it into that data breach. We're seeing the same data being reflected. But then there's another data set that really contradicts what we're seeing, what the data breach investigation report is showing, and that is that our spending on securing web applications is really out of whack based on the percentage of attacks we're seeing in our environment, and then the way that the data that we see in the data breach investigation report around the dominance of those types of attacks causing problems. And that spending is really, $23 of every $23 of security spending, $1 is spent on web application security. And so you start to say, what's going on? Like, we're not all, we should be data-driven. What's going on? We think there's some issues here around why there is this disconnect between so many of these web application attacks causing problems and the investment is really around two things. Those types of attacks being underreported in some instances and also misunderstood. So just a moment to talk about kind of awareness and this awareness disconnect. This is just a Google trend map on keywords, and their prevalence in the Google data around, keywords around types of attacks. And as you can see, the things that kind of bubble up are malware and ransomware, and it's like a lot of the web application attacks, which actually, are resulting in a lot of these breaches, are sort of under the covers. Now, this data set is a little bit old. I bet if we ran it again in the last 4 weeks, we might see Apache struts kind of jump up there with that being so critical and that, kind of a jumping off point in that Equifax breach. But, overall, these types of attacks don't get as much attention. And, we talked a lot about news media and what they focus on. That's been a kind of a conversation widely beyond just security, of course. But it's very natural for the media to kind of reflect and gravitate towards stories that are interesting or stories that individual users will resonate with. And, it's kind of our hypothesis that there's a lot of talk about, if there's an attack on a mobile phone or if there's some sort of exploit malware, it impacts users directly, people feel it, it gets reported, people can resonate with it, it gets picked up and moved along in the cycle. Email theft. We've heard enough about email theft probably for a lifetime over the last, 14 months or so. So the other thing that we see is that breach disclosures are required. We all know that in a lot of states. But the breaches, when those breaches are announced, they oftentimes don't contain a lot of technical detail, at least not right out of the gate when they're getting their huge splash. We are seeing that some of the large ones like Equifax or we're seeing that conversation happen a little more quickly because it is so massive. But overall, these breaches, they happen, we hear about a number of records, and then it kind of fades into the background, and those technical details aren't released. And, who wants to release the technical details about what happened, right? It's embarrassing. So sometimes, those aren't reflected as well. So, we're humans. Our perception of things is influenced by what we're seeing in the media, and we think that, partly what's driving our awareness disconnect is that reliance on perception versus some of the data that we're seeing. And that, in fact, probably our spending around this category probably needs to shift a little bit to take into account the impact that it's having in environments. So now I'll take a minute to talk about a case study that's pretty interesting that talks about how web application attacks, in fact, quite simple ones, can cause a problem. And this gentleman is really interesting, Alexei Balan. Someone we all hope we never have the pleasure of having around our environments or attacking our environments. But he's one of the most prolific hackers from 2013 to 2015. He's still out there. We assume he's still out there. He had a lot of dealings with a lot of folks in Russia, so he's still on our top 10 most wanted list. We assume he's on some island somewhere enjoying the spoils of his riches. But he's responsible for some of the huge breaches that we heard about in that time frame. So Yahoo, Zappos, Evernote, 1.2 billion user accounts kind of in total. So we talk about 145 million for Equifax, huge, devastating. This gentleman alone responsible for 1.2 billion user accounts being compromised in these different breaches. I think it's interesting to take a moment and and look at his techniques, because they aren't, he's so prolific, and yet his techniques are not particularly fancy, because it kind of illustrates the basic kind of measures that we need to think about when we're looking at web application security, and how some general hygiene and awareness of where our soft underbelly is can help prevent some of these issues. So Alexei, goes out and decides it's time to attack a certain organization. His first step was to do things, was to go and look for peripheral assets. Now, peripheral assets, what do I mean by that? I mean, everyone knows that the core applications where if there's your key data is in there, there's critical applications that if they're not running, if they're not secure, if the data within it doesn't have integrity, you're in trouble. There's a lot of focus on those applications, but most of our businesses have a lot of other applications too. And we pick on marketing quite a bit, but marketing organizations will stand up a web application, for a certain purpose, whether it be a launch of a product or to do some sort of customer acquisition or an e-commerce initiative that's kind of off to the side. Oftentimes, those types of peripheral assets are a very, short-lived sort of project, but they kind of live on. They're out there. They're off the radar a little bit. They're not focused on. And a lot of times, they leverage a lot of third-party applications, because that's an easy way to get up and get running, which have a lot of vulnerabilities with them. So Alexei would start by looking for these peripheral assets. He's not going to go for the gold right out of the gate. He's looking for these peripheral assets. And then he's also identifying, using LinkedIn, who are some people that have titles that would indicate that they would have escalated privileges within the organization. I want to find those admins, people with titles that look like admins who are going to have credentials that will be of use of me. So I want to know who those people are. Then he goes about a very simple attack, actually. It's goes after a vulnerability in WordPress that was released in 2011. So you'd think, when all this is happening, it's been a couple years, it's time for that to be patched, but we all know that doesn't always happen, right? So this CVE 2011 4106, we're going to talk about it a little more on the next page, because it's a doozy. Not in terms of, in its criticality, but also just the broadness of how it was used. So we found one of these peripheral assets with WordPress running, with this vulnerability, was able to get in, get control, and at that point modified the authentication mechanism so he could collect usernames, credentials, essentially. And in doing that, he already has his list of which credentials are useful to me and which are not. He goes about grabbing the good credentials and basically having a grand old time within the environment. So he used Nmap to kind of discover it, pretty typical. And then he also used the internal wiki pages. We've all got them, right? Where well, a lot of us do, right? Wiki pages where we're capturing, each group is kind of capturing information about what they're doing. Well, the admins within Yahoo had a wiki page. On that page, they actually were storing some key authentication keys, critical authentication keys. Well, there it was. So he was able to pick those up. And then kind of moving forward, got to a point where, in his kind of grand finale, was even using developer credentials to put backdoor into their code and dropping it into their GitHub. So he really owned them, and it was slow and deliberate, based on a very, trivial to patch, probably trivial to have, security controls around WordPress vulnerability to execute this attack. So why did he look at WordPress? He's not, he was definitely, looking at that application because of its prevalence. 28% of websites on the internet have WordPress. It dominates the rest of the third-party applications in this content management system. If you think about anytime you leave a comment on a site, anytime you're updating content, this is the kind of application that's out there. And the interesting thing is when you have this really broad base of distribution for this application, a vulnerability like that one found in 2011 can have huge impacts across the globe, really. And in this case, Alexei wasn't the only one using this vulnerability. 1.2 million compromised sites based on that vulnerability. And the thing is, there are 53 other vulnerabilities like this in the last 10 years on WordPress. And so CVSS 6+, things you need to pay attention with, and they just continue to grow. And that's not where that third-party vulnerability long tail kind of stops. We have to look at the underlying technologies as well. So PHP, another kind of big offender here in terms of the vulnerability, the vulnerabilities out there. Constant kind of drumbeat with a couple peaks. Unfortunately, one peak in 2016 with 106 vulnerabilities. So you've got WordPress, you've got the PHP language and platform upon which it's sitting, each coming with their own set of vulnerabilities. And then what is, when you do have these large contributors of vulnerabilities, what we see is that, if you look at the top 100,000 websites that are out there, 30% of them have PHP. They're using kind of a LAMP stack. Another 18% have Microsoft. So between those two, if you understand the vulnerabilities that are there, you kind of have a good view that, of the places, the things you need to be thinking about and protecting when you're moving to the cloud. And that brings us to kind of thinking about how we secure web applications. The way that we talk about it at Alert Logic and the way we think about creating our solution so that it is able to have a significant impact on reducing our customers' risks around cloud applications is we think about that a cloud attack surface from not just at that web code level, but all the way through the stack. So moving down from dev platforms all the way down to the actual cloud platforms themselves. And there are a wide range of attacks at every level. You need to have you need to think about and have instrumentation at every level to be able to guard against these attacks. Rapidly changing development. So a lot of times when customers are looking to move to the cloud, they're looking to harness some more agile development cycles. That rapidly changing developing code can often introduce unknown vulnerabilities. You've got lots of exposures from those third-party elements we were just talking about. You've got, and then you have this problem, which is there's also an extreme shortage of people that are experts that can really guide you in how you do this. It's very difficult to maintain high level of application security expertise in your organization and have enough of them to address this problem. So let's quickly go through some of the different factors at different layers. We'll quickly talk about this and then we'll dive into one area a little more deeply. So custom-built web code, we all know that in that area we've got to be looking at not these known vulnerabilities like we were talking about with WordPress and PHP, but unknown vulnerabilities. So OWASP top 10 type attacks and making sure that we have the necessary ability to block and detect those types of attacks. We need to be thinking about those long tails of third-party vulnerabilities in the open frameworks, commercial development frameworks that we're using. We need to be, if we have a 3-tier architecture, web-based architecture with a relational database, we need to immediately be zeroing in on an OWASP top 10 attack, which is SQLi, which we're going to go into in a little more detail. And then we need to think about being open and, whether our environments are open and interconnected. So this is we all would love to, sometimes it's like, oh, let's go to the cloud, that journey to the cloud, we're going to click our heels and we're going to be there. That doesn't really happen, right? So a lot of times we move into a hybrid environment where we've got applications in the cloud that are talking to databases that are in databases that are in a data center, and so we've got to understand that connectivity and how they come together. So I want to drill into one of these types of threats just to kind of give you a view of, there is some of the things that are really challenging in terms of securing web applications. So we're reverting back to some of our own Alert Logic data. And as I mentioned, 75% of the attacks that we see coming into our security operations centers are web application attacks. And this is a representation of those attacks. And the big red one, probably kind of hard to read from where you are, but trust me, it's SQL injection. And SQL injection is what I kind of like to think of as a perfect storm type of attack, and one that, that is often at the top, it's always on the top of the OWASP top 10 list. And the reason for that is that it requires a very low level of skill to execute. Tools are readily available. It has a really, it has the potential for a really immediate impact if you are successful with the attack. There can be exfiltration kind of very quickly. And thirdly, this is kind of a human, an element that is on all of us as we are sitting trying to prevent these things and watching the alerts come in, is that they're very noisy types of attacks. It's a process whereby you are, probing that database to see if you can get a response that's going to see if you're going to get the correct response and be successful. So you probe and probe and probe. And that's all well and good when there's a tool kicking off and doing that work, but when you're sitting in a security operations center or you're monitoring, whatever IDS or WAF you have out there and you're looking at those alerts coming in, you get tired, right? There's a ton of them. And you have to sift through to try to understand what's out there, whether they're successful or not. And this is something, because of that big size of that red block, this was something that we saw in our SOC ourselves, that we were having these attacks that would come in. Obviously, we were aggregating them, right? We weren't looking at the alerts Wednesday, Tuesday, but even when you got an aggregated incident, there were events that were sometimes hundreds or thousands of events composed in this incident, and then it was up to an analyst to kind of pick through and try to see which of those events might have actually been a successful event, a successful breach and a successful attack. So what we saw is that it was very difficult to detect these attacks through the noise, right? We're looking at this, we can't really see it. We saw that this was a place where the human on its own had a very difficult time finding these, even when enabled with really good detection technology. And so what we found that we needed to do was apply some algorithms that could help us see the stages of the attack, could filter through all that data and surface to us the places where we did need to have concern, where we were seeing that they were successful in their attempt, and accordingly could kind of go from a situation where there was data just flowing by us and we're hoping to pick through the needles and find something, to having the alert that comes up be something that is, hey, this isn't just a SQL injection attempt. This is a successful attempt, and you need to take some action. Get up, get out of bed. It's time to go to work. So now I'm just going to, we've talked through a lot about the attack surface and what we need to worry about. And again, I think that's really important before we dive into what controls, is kind of understanding what do we need to be focused on. Oh, well, what do we need to be focused on? What's that attack surface we need to be focused on? Kind of start there. So when we go into the actual practice of developing this blueprint, it is about first understanding what you have, and then understanding what those things are vulnerable to, what the attacks are. And as we mentioned, what we see as you're moving to the cloud is that the threat that you really need to focus on are web applications, securing web application, and web application attacks. So what we suggest and kind of help customers do is enumerate your cloud footprint, understand what's out there, understand what third-party applications, understand the type of code you have out there, right? Because legacy code sometimes is a little bit more of a problem than new code, right? We forget about things. New vulnerabilities come out. Nobody wants to work on those old things. So really get a feel for not only what you have, but kind of what state it's in. Then we need to identify the most relevant threats. So understanding, what elements we have, kind of building a threat model of, what are the things that are going to attack those various assets, and how do I go about guarding against that? Thinking through things like, configuration assessment and vulnerability assessment. Making sure we know what our exposures are, making sure we have capability around pre-compromise analysis, right? So what can we block? What can we immediately push off and make sure it's not an issue for us? And then post-compromise analysis, which, as our conversation started out with, compromise is not, this is our reality, right? Compromises happen. Preparing for when is being prepared for, detecting a compromise early, grabbing that first domino as it starts to fall before the rest of them go, because most of these attacks are, take days, take months, take weeks, right? If you can stop at an early stage, you've isolated your blast radius, and you go from something that's devastating and in some cases career-ending, right, to something that you can get your arms around and is more of an annoyance. And then third, you kind of build your coverage model. So you've identified that your blueprint. You start to kind of look at some of the characteristics in that blueprint. Oh, look, here I've got a 3-tier architecture that's operating, code that we've developed. I need to make sure that I've got OWASP top 10 coverage. How am I going to be blocking and detecting those attacks? What kind of inspection do I have on HTTP traffic so I can make sure that I'm catching those? SQL injection attacks. If we have that third-tier, 3-tier application with a relational database, making sure we have, the best tools possible to be detecting a SQL injection attempt. Because again, a SQL injection breach, because again, those can be very quickly impactful. Understanding, within our blueprint, what stack we're using. Is it Microsoft? Is it LAMP? Okay, so how do I have the right visibility across my network and my logs to be able to detect something that's going on there? And then when we do have those critical applications that many times are revenue driving applications, those third-party specific applications that we talked about that can be a source of huge threat, making sure we have coverage for those as well. Oh, we're running out of time here, so let me just build that really quickly. And so this is about kind of building up that visibility, kind of looking at how we build up that visibility across our blueprint, kind of bringing in that configuration and vulnerability information, building on top of that with a view of network telemetry and network traffic and what threats we can cull out of that. There's a lot of them. Bringing in log data, bringing in deep HTTP inspection and blocking, so we kind of have that full picture of that full application stack, and can deliver an integrated solution. And this is just another way to look at it. This is something that you can work with a partner to build. You can build yourselves. You can work with a company to bring together. It's sort of difficult to do on your own. I suggest looking for some help in this process. But what we really see is that you really need an integrated solution to be able to protect against this full stack. That point solutions at different places that aren't brought together are not, sometimes don't give you the coverage you need as you're moving into the cloud. So again, it's about assessing that exposure, blocking whatever we can, getting that out of the way, bringing in traffic that we don't know the nature of it, whether it's malicious or good, putting it through an analytics stack that has the ability to detect, to use different detection methods, best suited for the type of attack, whether, some things are really great with just a straight up rules, machine learning, anomaly detection, have all of those things in your arsenal, and then have that surfaced in a way that you can consume it, right? That you're provided with information, if something is spit out to you, that it's in a format that you can respond to it, that it has enough information for you to go say, I understand what this is, and I know what I need to do. And then, obviously a huge part of this is the people element. You need the people to create the content for this analytics engine. You need the people to write the rules. You need, potentially data scientists to help data scientists for machine learning. And then you obviously need folks with their eyes on the glass 24/7 to make sure that when something does go wrong, you're able to see it quickly, you're prepared, and you're ready to respond.